What's happening, everybody, and welcome back to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm your host, Josh Zorhoff, and I am a pastor and a therapist in the West Michigan area. And this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless family of churches and my good friends at Care Portal. And I'm excited to continue a conversation with you today, coming off of our last conversation about the stress responses. And I want to take that a little bit further and talk about some things that we can do when we are, in fact, experiencing stress, or we're in a situation where we feel like our thoughts are getting the better of us. Let me start with a question for you. Have you ever had a thought that seems to have a mind of its own? A thought that just comes out of nowhere and almost takes on its own life or initiative and tends to run wild in your mind. Typically, these are negative thoughts that control how we think throughout the day or control how we feel in the moment. Have you ever had a thought that seem to have a life of its own? It's actually pretty common. Did you know that Americans, specifically those of us living in this post-COVID reality, have roughly 50,000 thoughts every single day? Before the pandemic, that was about 30 to 40,000. But because of the increased isolation, because of the trauma of COVID-19 and that whole season that we were in, because we are living in an information saturated reality in our lives right now, we have about 50,000 thoughts running through our brains every single day. So that's a lot. That is in its own right enough to make us exhausted by the end of the day. But here's another interesting thing. Have you ever had a negative or critical thought throughout the day? Did you know that of those 50,000 thoughts that we think every single day, 80% of them are negative, are critical, either negative or critical of others, but more than that, usually critical or negative of ourselves. We have, on a given day, 80% of our thought patterns are negative. Now, here's a really interesting bit. Of those 50,000, 80% of which are negative and critical, of those thoughts, 90% of those thoughts repeat every single day. So we have essentially 30 plus thousand, maybe almost 40,000 thoughts that are critical, that we think negatively about ourselves or other people. And they just repeat day after day after day after day after day. And so if you're like me and you have some negative thoughts, and these negative thoughts influence or change the way that you see other people, or they influence or change your behavior, or you just get stuck in this spinning pattern of negativity in your mind, that can get really frustrating. I know it does for me. In fact, there are times where I will catch myself thinking, we don't often think about what we think about, but it's really important to think about what we think about, because we don't often think about all of the negative statements that go through our mind. But if we stop, I stop sometimes and I think about all of the things that I'm thinking about. And I'll think things like, that was stupid, or that was foolish, or Josh, you shouldn't have said that, or you shouldn't have done that. I had that yesterday. I actually made a mistake in a sermon that I preached at a church. Now, most people probably didn't catch the mistake, but I'm super critical of myself. And so I caught the mistake shortly after I left the church. And last night I was replaying that mistake in my mind, thinking that was stupid. I shouldn't have done that. I should have been a better researcher. I should have been more clear on that point. I should have thought that, or I should have caught that. And I have this whole negative process that I enter into because I made one mistake. I made one error in a 30-minute message. And maybe you've had that. Maybe you've had that where maybe it's not a sermon for you, but it's a full day of work and you made one mistake in a full day of work, or you made a mistake in your full day of activity, or you had a really good day, but there was that one thing that you did that is dominating how you see yourself and is dominating the story that you tell yourself about yourself. We do that a lot. And when those thoughts come in, when those negative and critical statements come in, there's a term for that, incidentally. It's called a neural hijack. It's where the thoughts that we think kind of hijack our brain and start taking control over our mind, over our emotions, over our responses. Those thoughts can turn into triggers that trigger those stress responses that we talked about. So how we think and how we address that neural hijack is really important. And I want to ask a question. Do you want to stop that neural hijack? Do you want to have a life where you don't feel like your thoughts are in control of you, but you actually feel like you are in control of your thoughts? Did you know that that's possible? Did you know it's possible to change the way you think? And I want to walk through some critical strategies on how to do that. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about how those thoughts influence who we are and who we become. Whenever you have a thought, specifically a critical thought or a negative thought, if that thought persists for more than 2 minutes, it will transfer into our short-term memory. Now, if that thought pattern continues and we allow it to continue, and that's one of those negative statements that repeats day after day after day. If that repeats and that stays in our short-term memory for more than a few days, maybe even sometimes more than a few hours, it can move from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. And of course, if that then stays for a couple more days or moves into a couple of weeks or a couple of months, after a period of time, it will move from our long-term memory into our core beliefs. That is how we see ourselves, how we see the world, how we see other people, what we think about us, how we operate from day to day. And I'll use a specific example from my own life to help work through this. So maybe as I'm talking about how this has impacted me, you can think about how this has impacted you. I grew up in a family of 4 children, and I was the middle child, and my older sister and my younger sister and my identical twin brother. Yes, I have an identical twin brother. His name's John. We grew up in a pretty good family. My mom and dad loved us. And for the most part, I have a lot of positive memories of my childhood. And yet, because I was a middle child, there were times where I felt left out. I felt overlooked. And I didn't always feel important. And I did have, from an early age, this thought of, I need to be noticed. I need to be seen. I'm not important. I don't feel important. I'm not special. So I need to do whatever I can to be noticed and to be seen. And that was just a thought that was there in my mind. And as I got older, that thought continued. And now as I'm in my 40s, there's a little part of me that always wants to be seen, always wants to be noticed, always wants to be needed, always wants to be important and special. And if I'm not careful, that thought, that early thought from my childhood can influence and often impact the way that I relate to other people. Maybe I'll embellish, or I'll exaggerate, or I'll prove my need to be in the room by saying something really smart or talking over someone or interrupting someone. I have to be really careful, because that thought that came to me as a child has now moved into not only my short term, but my long term and even my core beliefs. And that's something I got to wrestle with. And so it's really important to address the thoughts that we have so that they don't move into our core beliefs, specifically the negative thoughts in our core belief of who we are. And I want to talk about how we can do that. I want to give you some simple strategies that can help us work through those negative thoughts. But here's the first thing to realize in that. It is not enough to not think about that thought. Let me say that again. It is not enough to not think about that thought. In fact, years ago, researchers came out with some pretty incredible brain science, some neuroscience that proved when we try to not think a thought, we actually cause the neural connections in the brain to grow 5 times larger than normal. When you try to not think about something, or you say, don't think about that, what you're essentially doing is causing yourself to think about it more. If I were to say to you right now, don't think about a purple elephant, what are you thinking about? A purple elephant. The same is true with the negative thoughts that we have in our brain. If you say, don't think about that, don't think about that, don't think about that, don't think about that, just don't think about that. What are you thinking about? That. You're thinking about that. And so what you really want to do, instead of trying to not think about something, you want to think differently. You want to replace that thought. And I want to talk through how you go about doing that. When you are in a specific negative thought pattern, the first thing to do is stop. Sounds weird? But I actually invite my clients and my people that I work with to say stop, or to have something tangible, whether that is a bracelet or a key ring on your keychain, or a keychain ring, something on your physical person that reminds you to stop. I have a friend who has a bracelet that says stop. It's one of these little rubber bracelets. If you can see this, it's a rubber bracelet. And he says stop, and he snaps that bracelet. It's important to say stop. So just for example, when I get into these thought patterns of thinking I'm not good enough or I'm not important, I carry a little notepad with me. And sometimes I will just write the word stop, or I will take time to quietly just say stop to myself. That's true of any negative thought that I have. When it comes up, I acknowledge it, I recognize it, and I say, stop. Josh, stop. So stop. You actually have control over what you think about, and you don't have to think that thought. So say stop to yourself. Stop that thought. And then, this is critical, breathe. Neuroscience proves that breathing, deep diaphragmatic breathing, those long, slow, deep, and steady breaths can actually reroute blood flow from the limbic system, which is in the back of our brains. It's the part of the brain that is reactive, to the prefrontal cortex and the neocortex, the part of our brain that we need for critical thinking and compassion and love and kindness. We can reroute that blood flow by breathing. Now, I have something fun and exciting for you. I actually created a YouTube video that has what I call box breathing. And if you've listened to the podcast before, my friend Dave McGovern also talked about this, but you imagine a box in front of you, and in each corner, you have corner one, breathe in for 5 seconds, and then you have hold for 5 seconds, and then breathe out in corner 3 for 10 seconds, and then you have be still for 5 seconds. And you work your way around the box. And I actually have created a video that I'm going to link to the podcast notes. If you would like to have that video, it's got the breathing on it, lasts for about 2 minutes. It's got the instructions with a little countdown calendar or countdown clock. And there's some music to it as well, nice calming music. And so that's something that you can do, but you want to stop and then you want to take 2 minutes to breathe. Breathing helps reroute that blood flow, helps get us back into the right state of mind. And after you've done that breathing, you want to replace, not think about it, think differently. Replace that thought with something more positive. Something that is good, something that is beautiful, something that is lovely, as the Apostle Paul writes in Philippians 4, something that is worthy of praise, something that is good and lovely and pure and worthy of praise. Replace that thought with something good or something true, something better or kind for you. And it can really be anything. It can be the opposite of what you're thinking. The problem is most of the time we don't believe the opposite of what we're thinking. So if we believe that we are not good enough, it's hard for us to believe that we are in fact good enough. So make sure that it's something that you are confident in and you're not going to get into an argument with yourself about it. I actually have some go-to thoughts. One, if I'm really stuck in it and I can't think of something positive, I think about making a pizza. I know it sounds silly, but I imagine myself for at least, and you have to think about something for about 2 minutes. 2 minutes to replace that thought with something more positive. I imagine myself rolling out the dough of a pizza, maybe flipping that dough up in the air like I'm a really cool pizza making person. And then I will imagine myself putting sauce on the pizza, and then I imagine putting the cheese on the pizza, and then I imagine putting the different toppings on, whether that's ham and pineapple. Some of you don't like that and you just got grossed out. Maybe it's pepperoni, maybe it's a meat lovers, but I imagine myself putting all of the toppings on the pizza. And then I imagine myself putting in the oven. And I imagine the cheese bubbling up, and I imagine the crust crisping at the bottom, and I imagine pulling it out, and I imagine cutting it into slices. And that usually takes me about 2 minutes. And that's good. And it's positive. And it makes me happy. And so I can replace that thought with pizza. I can also replace the thought with some memories that are really good, healthy, and beautiful for me. I have some really good memories. I have one memory in specific that I think about when I'm having a really tough day or I'm having a really tough moment and my thoughts are just running wild. I think about the day that our son was born. My wife, Christy, was in labor for 30 plus hours and most of it was back labor. And so it was really painful and we were up really early and then it looked like he was going to have some trouble coming into the world. So they made the call to do a cesarean. And so they did surgery and then he was born. And we had this moment where, he was he was in Christy's arms and it was all new, and we brought him up to the room and he didn't sleep really well and we hadn't slept really well. And we were going on about at that point, 48 hours, almost three days without really good sleep. We were exhausted. He wasn't sleeping. He was crying. We couldn't get him to sleep. We couldn't rock him to sleep. It was crazy. It was really frustrating. Christy was in tears. I was in tears. It was not this great moment, not what we expected. And then this nurse came in and she rocked our son to sleep, and she put a sign on the door, essentially telling people to stay out and leaving us undisturbed. And he slept for 4 hours and we slept for 3. And then we got up and Christy took a shower and I took a shower and we changed our clothes and we felt like new people. We felt like new people. And in the quiet, we were a family. And we were fresh and ready to go. And for me, that's probably one of the greatest memories of my life. And in this moment, as I share that with you, you can't piss me off. There's nothing you could say to me right now that could shift me out of that beautiful moment. And that's the kind of thought that you want. You want to stop the negative thought. You want to stop that hijack. You want to breathe to get that blood flowing back to the part of our brain that is curious and good and healthy. And then you want to replace that thought with something beautiful. And my hope is that you can actually do this. In fact, I've made a little infographic that I will attach to the podcast notes along with the link to the YouTube video that you can use to do some of that breathing yourself. But I just want to invite you, if you find yourself in negative thought patterns, to consider the power of stopping that thought, breathing, and replacing it. You don't have to be held captive to the negative thoughts that run wild in your mind. You can stop those thoughts and you can think differently. And I'm excited to continue on this conversation with you as we explore emotional health and we explore how our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions impact our lives. And I just want to say, we are so grateful for you following along with this podcast. We would love it if you would give us a follow on Spotify, maybe give us some stars on iTunes, leave a comment about how this has helped you in some way. If this has been a helpful podcast for you, please share it with a friend, share it on social media, or if you'd like more information on how you can engage in emotional health, send us an email to chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org. Or you can go to our website, fearlesschaplaincy.org. We'd love to connect with you and talk more about these realities of emotional health. Maybe come into your workspace and talk a little bit about how we can do better work at navigating our emotions. We'd love to help you with that as well. That's all we've got for you now. We'll talk with you later.